that most scholars accept.
The four-source theory as the explanation for why the Synoptic Gospels are the way they are, so similar and yet so different. And we saw that that consisted of a chart that looks sort of like a bow tie. Fill in for me what goes there. This will jog your memory. What are the four sources? M, Q. Good. And what do they feed into? Excellent. Good. We give an explanation for why scholars hypothesize Q. That sort of makes sense, at least to me. And we give an explanation for why they hypothesize M and L. By the way, the reason why we can't simply attribute all of M and all of L to the evangelist making things up or changing things completely to their audience is because sometimes the passages in M and L have some kind of distant relationship to one another. I'm answering the question that you asked. Her question, she preferred to bring it up during the break, was how do we know M just wasn't what Matthew wrote? And how do we know L isn't simply what Luke decided to create? Well, that won't quite wash because take for example, the infancy stories. We attribute the one set of infancy stories to M, the ones that appear in Matthew, and we attribute the other to L because they're so different. We don't say that they're from Q, even though infancy stories only appear in Matthew and Luke, they're too different to believe that both of these came from the same written source in front of Matthew and Luke. So we attribute Matthew chapters 1 and 2 to M, and Luke chapters 1 and 2 to L. On the other hand, it can't be the case that Matthew decided to create some Christmas stories and came up with this, and Luke decided to create some Christmas stories and came up with his, because even though they're drastically different, they do have that same ultimate basic backbone that's similar. They both have some kind of celestial sign. They both have some kind of annunciation. They both have the virgin birth. They both have birth in Bethlehem, etc. So, however these versions that we attribute to M and to L came about, they surely go back to some kind of ultimate single source. Maybe there was an original Christmas story, maybe from Mary, who was there, who knows. But as it got transmitted, probably orally, over the decades, it got altered enough that it wound up being as drastically different as we now see in these two versions. At any rate, that ultimate structural similarity argues that this M and this L passage cannot have simply been created by Matthew and Luke, respectively.
Yeah, I just want to comment. I just don't feel like you can totally discard the word of mouth theory. And given the time, there was far from 100% literacy. There was quite a bit of word of mouth, and to tie in, I guess, from what we learned in the Old Testament, of course, when I think the issue was raised about transcribing all the material for 5,000 years or something, and the high degree of accuracy that was maintained from one scribe to the next. And it seems to me people at times, if they took their religion very seriously, especially when they had to rely on word of mouth, it just seems that telephone theory could in part be true. I mean, maybe that accounts for some of the differences observed between Mark and Luke, but some of the basic similarities as well.
I agree.
But again, I mean, just the word of mouth, religion is a serious issue, the low level of literacy. And if we say it applies verbally to that, then it seems like we have to go back to the Old Testament and revisit whether transcribing scroll of 5,000 years is the same thing that happened. I also would contend that what gets into the Bible are things that ultimately is guided by God. So if it was word of mouth, God is going to be sure that what he wants in the Bible is going to be passed on verbatim, for at least what's required, but like what's required for our salvation. And
I agree with all that you said, and I don't want to minimize the amount of oral transmission that might have existed back then. Presuming that Jesus died and resurrected in 30 AD, that means that all of Jesus' deeds and sayings would have been roughly in that public ministry period of 27 to 30, if we go with the 3-year ministry. How likely is it that the first disciples would have written down right away everything that they remembered about Jesus? Well, it's not very likely. For one thing, as we mentioned, I think last class, everybody thought the end of the world was coming, quite reasonably. I mean, if someone I knew showed up after their death, I would think that the world was coming to an end. That kind of breaking in of the supernatural into the natural is naturally going to prompt people to think that the crack is going to enlarge and that the whole universe is going to come to an end. So it's not likely that there would have been creation of gospels right away. Even the Satan's collection, Q, most scholars would say probably comes from around 50. Which still leaves a couple of decades for those sayings to have been transmitted orally. And if M and L were orally transmitted, M wound up getting written down in Matthew's Gospel around 85, and L winds up getting written down in Luke's Gospel around 90. That still leaves a very long time for oral transmission to have taken place. I very much agree that we should not diminish the influence of oral transmission. I also agree with your point about oral transmission could have been more careful back then than it is now. At the same time, I wouldn't want to exaggerate that too drastically. There was a book written back in the 60s called Memory and Manuscript, which made exactly that argument, that the words we have of Jesus are exactly the way he said them, because this was not a literate culture, and therefore everybody memorized everything and passed it on exactly. But lots of scholars have examined that hypothesis since then, and virtually nobody else agrees. It's just too much variation in the Gospels for that to have been the case. Still, I think there's room for arguing that they were more careful than we are nowadays, because we don't bother memorizing it. Plug it into our daytimer or computer or whatever we forget that. And lastly, your point about inspiration. I totally agree with that. My assumption is that if there was oral transmission, God is going to ensure that that line of transmission all the way along is going to wind up being what he wants to put in there. So if Peter was at the Sermon on the Mount one afternoon, and if he went home that night and over supper he said to Mrs. Peter, God, you wouldn't believe what I heard Jesus say today. And he says, yeah, the parable of the speckled log, which just happens to be part of the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe his wife went out the next morning to the backyard to put up the laundry, and here's the neighbor wife putting up her laundry, and he says, oh, you will not believe what Peter said Jesus said today. And Mrs. Peter relates the speckled log, and then that night the neighbor wife tells the neighbor guy, and that just goes on and on like that. God caused the scriptures to teach without error that truth that's necessary for our salvation. So to whatever extent all of this material is necessary for salvation, God intervened all the way along. He intervened when Peter told it over the supper table. He intervened when Mrs. Peter told it over the laundry line, etc. I have no problem with that. This is God's creation. He can do whatever he wants to. He can intervene anywhere, any way he wishes. So I assume that that's the case. That inspiration ought to be thought of not just in terms of writing, but also in terms of oral transmission. Excellent point. The one thing that we haven't proven, we've established M, L, and Q pretty well, but the one thing we have not yet explained is why do most scholars think Mark was written first? Because you remember those other two hypotheses? The Augustinian presumed that Matthew was written first. Matthew, then Mark, then Luke. The Greek we spot presumes that Matthew wrote first. Matthew, then Luke, then Mark. So why is it that these scholars opt for Mark as having been written prior to Matthew and Luke? That's where I want to start next time. But in order to start there, I want to make sure that we all know where we're starting at. We're going to finish off the four-source theory, because we've explained most of it, except that one crucial background. Why is it that scholars believe Mark wrote first? And I want to give the reasons for that. But I want to allow some time for questions here. We've got 15, 20 minutes left, and I know there must be questions. Let's have some questions to finish up tonight, and then we'll do that next time. Yes, sir.
Well, can we assume that or since you said Matthew was an apostle, the author of that gospel, evangelist, can we assume that M was partially, he was there, he was an eyewitness?
Well, you're raising the question of the authorship of the Gospels.
Can you repeat those questions? I can hardly hear what you say.
Yes. He raised the question of the authorship of the Gospels. So I'd like to deal with that a bit. We say that Matthew wrote the first Gospel, Mark wrote the second, Luke wrote the third, John wrote the last. Matthew was one of the 12 disciples. John was one of the 12 disciples. Mark and Luke were not. Mark traveled with Paul on some of his missionary journeys, and Luke traveled with Paul on some of his missionary journeys. But why do we think that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, etc.? Well, because it says so, right? Gospel according to Matthew. That's the title of the first Gospel. But you know what? If you take away that title, and you read the Gospel itself, from the first verse to the last, never once does it say who wrote it. And if you take away the title of Mark, never once does it say who wrote it. Take away the title of Luke, never once. Take away John, never once. None of the Gospels say anything about who wrote them, except in the titles. So then the question becomes, how certain are these titles? How reliable are they? When were they put on the front of the Gospels? John's Gospel refers to, quote, the beloved disciple. But never does John's Gospel say which disciple that was. It does refer to a beloved disciple, but it never says who it is. And the assumption that it's John is based on the title. So the crucial question is the titles. When were these added? My guess is they probably were not original parts of the documents. They got added later. Now, why would we assume that? Well, for one thing, they're rather egotistical, don't you think? The gospel according to me. The gospel according to me. If you wrote a record of our Lord's life, would you be sure to get your name in there? In the title? I don't think so. So a priori, there's a certain egotism there that you wouldn't expect. Secondly, there's the coincidence in form of all the titles. All of them have exactly the same form. The Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Matthew. If we had these Gospel writers in various cities coming up with different documents, it's rather curious that they all wound up entitling them the same. Then there's the question of the preposition according to. In Greek, that preposition is kata, K-A-T-A. And we translate it according to, but that's not quite what it means in Greek. In Greek, kata has a distributive sense. Now what that means is, kata has the sense of taking something and breaking it out into parts. You distribute something. So, if I had a bowl of, a cauldron of soup up here, and I put it in bowls and distributed it to all of you, I could say, this is the soup kata Moira, this is the soup kata Fred, etc. And just pass it around. Well, if that's the sense here, that kata indicates a single gospel divided out into 4 gospels, then those titles would not have been added until the 4 gospels were collected together. Because you can't say a part of the gospel according to Matthew, a part of the good news according to Luke, until you've got the good news all together. And then you can say it's distributed into 4 parts. And that's really what the Greek preposition indicates. So when were the titles added? Probably after the 4 Gospels were collected. So when were the 4 Gospels collected? Our earliest evidence is around 150. Now that doesn't mean they weren't collected sooner than that, but that's the earliest evidence we got. And even if it was 100, that's still awfully late of Mark. They simply add a bunch of stuff from M, Q, and L for the most part. So what Mark had? Well, you tell me, if Matthew was one of the 12 and an eyewitness who was there day by day, why would he rely upon Mark's gospel written by somebody who wasn't there? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's, in addition to the unreliability of the titles, there's some reasons for thinking that the titles are unreliable. So my preference is to say, and this is how I handle it, it doesn't matter ultimately who wrote the 4 Gospels. What matters is that they have been inspired by God in the form in which they have wound up in front of us. And those matters, crucial to our salvation that they teach, are taught without error. It's not crucial to my salvation whether Matthew or Barnabas or whoever wrote that first gospel. What's crucial to me is what it contains, what it says. So I prefer not to start with assumptions about this is the way this author was and this is the way this author was, and then make decisions about the Gospels. I prefer to start with the text and make inferences about what can we know about the author based upon what we have written here. Anyway, does that answer your question? So, what else would you like? I can't remember the rest of what we brought up.
Basically, what you're saying is there's a lot we don't know about the authorship. Of course, we're thinking now we have 4 sources, or theory is about most scholars. And obviously, sources have some lost.
Except Mark. Right. True. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you were suggesting a collaborative effort in maybe writing the Gospels and later acting on a name.
Not writing them, but collecting them.
No. Can you explain it?
Sure. Let me do another timeline here. Here's 30 AD. Jesus says many things, does many things. Many reports of those follow. Around 65 to 70, Mark's Gospel is written down. Around 85, Matthew's Gospel is written down. Around 90, Luke. And around 100, John. We don't know where these Gospels were written. We can make certain guesses. For example, whenever Mark refers to something, a peculiarly Jewish term, in parentheses afterward, he'll give the Latin translation. For example, he gives the Jewish word for sergeant in the Roman army, and then immediately afterwards he gives the Latin word, centurion. So, presumably he was writing for a Gentile audience. If he was writing for a Gentile audience, it was presumably not in Palestine, so he's somewhere out there in the Greco-Roman world. It could be in Alexandria, could be in Rome, could be in Ephesus, who knows? But basically, we don't know where these Gospels were written. But let's just give some thought to it. Suppose that one of them was written in Alexandria. Suppose that one of them was written in Ephesus. Suppose that one of them was written in Rome. Suppose that one of them was written in Antioch. We don't know. But wherever they were written, it would have taken a while for them to have come together in any one spot. Especially since they didn't have printing. If Luke, let's presume, wrote his gospel in Ephesus, then as soon as he finished, there was only one copy of Luke in existence. It would have taken months to produce 2 or 3 other copies, and more months to produce more copies. By the time they all wound up in the same spot, a number of decades probably will have passed. That moment at which the 4 Gospels were all in the same spot for the first time is the moment at which they were compiled. And that's different from the moment at which each of them was written. And all I was suggesting was there was collective effort to get them all compiled, and the earliest evidence of that is around 150.
So we're not sure that the effort might have been nonetheless collaborative. We don't know that for sure. It could have been collaborative and not just an individual author for each one.
The effort to write them or to compile them?
To write them.
The effort to write them.
Do we know anything about that?
If the only thing we know about the authors is title, then that does not preclude the possibility that a committee could have written one of the Gospels.
Now, you would imagine.
But I would suggest that that's unlikely.
Okay, but you would. Okay, I'm what I'm trying to figure out. You would imagine that these authors, whoever they were, singular or collective, would have followed the Jewish tradition in writing the Scripture. And if the Old Testament were books written collaboratively, then perhaps that would suggest maybe that the New Testament might have been as well, if they followed that tradition, of course. We don't know. Do we have any evidence the Old Testament was collaborative?
Some of the books in the Old Testament probably were gradually added to over centuries. For example, the book of Psalms. Some of the Psalms sound like they were written around 900 AD, others around 500, others around 300. So certainly that's a collaborative book. The book of Proverbs seems to have been compiled from smaller collections of Proverbs into the big collection of Judges. And those collections dated from different centuries. So yeah, there is some evidence for that. On the other hand, there's no reason to think Habakkuk was not written by one guy, or Zephaniah was written by one guy, or Jeremiah is all Jeremiah's, etc. So although there's some evidence for it, it doesn't seem to be the norm. And at least as far as the Gospels are concerned in the New Testament, the style of Matthew is a consistent style throughout the book, and different from the style of Mark, which is a consistent style throughout Mark's book, and same with Luke. In addition to style, way of writing, there are certain special interests that show up in Matthew's Gospel throughout his Gospel, and those differ from certain special interests that show up in Mark's Gospel and show up throughout his Gospel. So style and certain theological interests argue for a single author of each of the Gospels.
Just one last point, and then I'll stop. When we think of the Declaration of Independence, we say, well, who wrote that? Thomas Jefferson. But then that was also collaborative, because there were people, as he wrote, that they would edit, and people would, adjust things. And one can look at it and say it has a similar style and so forth. So even that, it's a good argument, but it's an argument.
But now you're talking about prior to the final composition. Thomas Jefferson used various phrases that were suggested by other people during the Continental Congresses and so on, right? Hey, okay, I don't have any problem with other people having got their 2 cents in during the period of oral transmission. But when you're talking about 85 and Matthew sitting down in his house at night, I I don't think there were other guys there helping him out. Right? He wrote that gospel. And certainly he used all kinds of sources. So collaborative in that sense, sure. But I don't think the final form was more than that.
Is it possible, I don't know, you don't know that much knowledge, but is it possible that they all, they're so similar that they're different? Maybe that they wrote all of these books, that, they were getting older, and they wanted to make sure that this knowledge was good and fragrant, and that the order of the year was possible?
Yeah, I think you raised a good point. Why is it that the Gospels finally got written down between 65 and 100? How come they weren't written down right
They
away?
were getting older, right?
Yeah, the apostles are starting to die off. Is my
Well, there
guess.
are 4 people, and they're different from the world. They want to see the matter. So they know how to do.
That would have been one of the motives for doing it.
So one is not that we create, but it's got to get. We are 4 sources.
I don't see that there's a contradiction between them.
Well, the Q, the M, and the L.
If Q was written in 50, whoever wrote Matthew in 85 used Q as one of his sources. And one of his reasons for wanting to write Matthew's gospel was to get a record of what Jesus said and did, because the apostles are gone now, or almost gone. I don't see how using sources would be contradictory or incompatible with wanting to get things down.
Okay, what I have in mind is that they wrote the books, and the books were there, and nobody can, here, interface with the book. They just wrote the book for themselves. There was no innovation, and that's what
Yeah.
we said. The core of the book is the same. They just use different words. So my mind somehow was saying, they went ahead and wrote the book because they wanted the word to be there. They managed to carry innovation with each other.
That seems to have been the case. Right? There's no evidence of Matthew and Luke getting together at night over a beer and pizza.
Well,
No, you okay, that's pretty good.
and then later, that Mark got, the book that Mark got Matthew, the book was.
No, most scholars would agree with you. They seem to have written independently of each other. If they were done, we don't know. No, we don't. We don't have the original copy of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. What we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The earliest portion of any of the New Testament still in existence is a part of a copy of John's Gospel. It's John chapter 18, verses 31 to 33. And it was discovered in the south of Egypt, and it dates back to about 125. But it's only about the size of a postage stamp. It's not very big. But that's the earliest fragment. That's the earliest copy of any part of the New Testament that we have. But that's pretty incredible when you think about it. Part of John's Gospel was all the way in the south of Egypt by 125. Bestseller. Good well done. Possible. She said, isn't it possible that whoever succeeded Peter as Pope in Rome could have commissioned the Gospels to be written and could have been the one who collected them? Is there any evidence, one way or the other? Not to my knowledge.
I was reading the lives of the popes and said that not until about 160 or 170 was the Bishop of Rome all around.
Yeah, hey, there's still people who don't recognize it. Doesn't mean he wasn't hopeful. Oh, sure. Yeah. True, but how extensively would that authority have been felt out in the boonies, meaning Palestine, or Syria, or Asia Minor? Because they didn't have communications like we do now. It's interesting speculation, but it has to stay speculation. We don't have any evidence whatsoever. Actually, we have one epistle by the fourth book called the Clement, and that was written about 96 AD. No, I guess not. Yes.
Can't we be liberal and say it's called the gospel according to Matthew, that the author agrees that it would be a single author is really collecting the sermons and homilies and such that have been delivered by Matthew and putting them all together. The author would not necessarily be the name that's attached, but it would be as he had preached that this would be and you would have, this is the way in the first book, one of them, because of the style that was recognized being that of Mark, that it would be named that, and then you had the later on ones, and these were other renditions of oral history as they pertain to another one, and that was according to so-and-so, et cetera, et cetera. And then you'd be using the literal term as related, as disseminated by.
Sure. Did everybody hear his question? I think that's a reasonable hypothesis.
Again, it would support the fact that the writing style was sufficiently, sufficiently good that it wouldn't be necessarily that it would have been common to the Mark or to they were not all at the same level of intelligence. As they come across, they're all written pretty much in the same academic style. Not academic style, but same type of vocabulary.
Yeah. I guess I have no particular problem with that hypothesis. I think it might work better for some of the Gospels than for others. A lot of scholars like that idea of John. And they argue that John's Gospel is based on traditions that ultimately came from John the Apostle. There's a complicated reason for saying that. Matthew I have more trouble with. For one reason, Matthew relies upon Mark. I've already mentioned that. I can't help getting away from the feeling that whoever put that title on the first gospel opted to call it after Matthew because that gospel is the only one that mentions the disciple name. All the other lists of disciples in Mark, Luke, and John, instead of saying Matthew, they say Levi. So somebody reading Matthew's gospel in 130 or something said, hey, I bet this is by Matthew, since it's mentions Matthew, nobody else knows. I don't know. We're treading in very thin ice with all this stuff. Extremely speculative, just because there's not a whole lot of evidence. Let's let this one be the last. Yeah. Oh, good question. Did Jesus have brothers and sisters? In Acts of the Apostles, for example, in Acts 15, you'll find references to a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And the author of Acts says that his name was James, the brother of the Lord. But if Jesus had brothers, what does that do to Mary's virginity? Because according to Catholicism, Mary was a virgin before and after the birth of Jesus. But if you look in the original Greek, the word for brother there is adelphos. You find that Greek root in the name of the city in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, which is city of brotherly love, right? That's the word that's used there for James, quote, the brother of the Lord. So does this necessarily mean a blood brother or not? Well, if you gather together all of ancient Greek writings, Aristotle, Plato, the Dramatists, the Gospels, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, etc., put it all together and look at every single instance of the word autophos, you'll discover that 3 out of 4 times it does indeed refer specifically to a brother with whom you share at least one parent, if not both. So a blood brother, full or half, one way or the other. That's the way it's normally used. But 1 out of 4 times, and that's a lot, it simply means a male relative. You find somebody referred to as so-and-so's autophos, and then you read on and discover that he's the guy's uncle. Or somebody who's a nephew can be called an autophos. Or somebody who's a first cousin can be called an autophos. So we, who believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary, presume that James was a, quote, brother of the Lord because he was a near male relative, but not, if you like, direct blood brother. And that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the Greek, permissible interpretation of the Greek.
That question is I guess in several times or not about can be used in comparisons to Vietnam. Because of the gospel that we have heard that Sunday, we heard the Sunday, we heard the Christ. We were at the church and asked them, we said that was not a problem in Vietnam, but here in the United States it was. People were very upset about it because in Vietnam they don't have a word to use cousin. And that he his first cousin for whom he used to be, he said, this is my brother, this is my sister.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That brings it all home. Oh, I'm going to use that next time somebody asks me. All right. Thanks, everybody.